Most sincere spiritual seekers tragically spend their entire earthly lives exhaustingly studying Joel Goldsmith's teachings, yet completely, violently miss the absolute single revolutionary insight that miraculously transforms absolutely everything. They beautifully read about spiritual healing, exhaustingly practice meditation, and desperately study consciousness principles. But they terrifyingly overlook the absolute foundational truth that makes all majestic healing and flawless manifestation possible. This is absolutely not about cheap earthly techniques or toxic human methods. This is about a breathtaking, radical shift exactly in understanding exactly who and what the divine actually is exactly in your fragile life. For agonizing decades, Joel discovered exactly what traditional, toxic religion deliberately, violently hides from you. He breathtakingly found that absolutely every desperate prayer you have been taught, every exhausting spiritual practice you have learned, and every cheap religious ceremony you have attended has been violently built exactly on a devastating, terrifying misunderstanding. This toxic misunderstanding violently keeps you permanently trapped exactly in crushing limitation, devastating illness, and terrifying lack. Every single time you exhaustingly pray, desperately asking a distant God to magically heal you, to cheaply provide for you, or to violently change your terrifying circumstances, you are actually tragically reinforcing the exact terrifying consciousness that violently created your devastating problem exactly in the first place. You are violently affirming terrifying separation completely between your fragile self and absolute divine power. Traditional, toxic prayer tragically treats the divine exactly like a cheap cosmic vending machine. You desperately insert your terrifying requests, violently push the fragile prayer button, and exhaustingly hope the desired earthly outcome magically drops down. But Joel miraculously discovered this toxic approach violently violates the absolute fundamental nature of spiritual reality. God is absolutely not a distant being who miraculously responds to cheap petitions. Let us fiercely examine the absolute, devastating core of this terrifying human misunderstanding. You must completely, permanently abandon absolutely everything. You have been tragically taught exactly about the nature of the divine and your fragile relationship to absolute spiritual power. The absolute main point you are terrifyingly missing is exactly this. God is absolutely not a distant power you desperately appeal to. God is exactly the majestic consciousness you fiercely recognize, already perfectly present, entirely within you. This is absolutely not cheap metaphor or fragile symbolism. Joel profoundly taught that the absolute, entire kingdom of God flawlessly exists exactly in your consciousness right now, completely, fully formed, majestically available, beautifully waiting only for your fierce recognition to flawlessly manifest exactly as absolute healing and majestic abundance in your earthly experience. Majestic recognition prayer, completely, violently reverses absolutely everything toxic traditional religion tragically teaches. Instead of violently asking a distant God to magically come to your fragile rescue, you fiercely recognize God, already flawlessly present. Instead of exhaustingly begging for magical healing, you majestically acknowledge the flawless wholeness, already perfectly established, exactly in absolute consciousness. This is exactly why terrified people tragically practice Joel's majestic techniques for agonizing years with absolutely no earthly results. They are terrifyingly, secretly treating majestic consciousness, work exactly as toxic petition. They tragically use cheap recognition language exactly while violently maintaining a terrifying begging mentality. They exhaustingly say the cheap human words exactly about God, within. But their terrified inner stance is violently, desperately reaching entirely towards something terrifyingly external. Something tragically separate. Something they falsely believe. They desperately need to magically obtain entirely through exhausting spiritual effort. The absolute, earth-shattering transformation miraculously happens the exact moment you fiercely grasp that you are absolutely not trying to violently create anything, exhaustingly change anything, or desperately get anything from a distant God. You are simply majestically recognizing exactly what is eternally, perfectly, completely present exactly in absolute consciousness right now. This majestic recognition absolutely does not miraculously produce cheap earthly healing exactly as a future human result. The absolute recognition itself is the flawless healing precisely because it violently dissolves the completely false consciousness that terrifyingly created the tragic appearance exactly of devastating illness or crushing lack in the press grows. First place, let us fiercely witness exactly how this breathtaking understanding miraculously transforms real human lives. Benjamin violently spent agonizing years, desperately praying exactly for earthly financial abundance, entirely using toxic, traditional methods. His terrifying earthly circumstances remained violently, completely the same, despite his exhausting, devoted daily prayer, but the absolute, breathtaking moment he miraculously shifted entirely from desperately asking a distant God to cheaply provide, to fiercely recognizing the infinite abundance, already perfectly present, exactly in absolute consciousness. Majestic earthly opportunities miraculously began appearing exactly within quiet days. This is absolutely not cheap magical thinking or toxic positive affirmation. This is fiercely understanding the absolute mechanics of exactly how majestic consciousness flawlessly manifests entirely as human experience. Joel miraculously discovered that absolute consciousness absolutely does not miraculously create your fragile experience exactly after you violently change it. Absolute consciousness is your actual experience. The absolute moment, his majestic consciousness completely changed entirely through fierce recognition. His experienced earthly reality flawlessly had to miraculously change precisely because there is absolutely no terrifying separation completely between absolute consciousness and majestic manifestation. Joel was absolutely not teaching a cheap human method for desperately getting earthly things from a distant God. He was breathtakingly revealing the absolute nature of reality itself. Now, fiercely examine the devastating terrifying medical crisis of Catherine. She was tragically diagnosed exactly with a terrifying medical condition. Earthly doctors violently said would require devastating, lifelong medication management. She had exhaustingly by fording, desperately prayed for magical healing entirely, using absolutely every toxic traditional method she knew. She violently attended cheap healing services, desperately had fragile prayer groups intercede, and exhaustingly begged a distant God daily to magically remove this terrifying condition completely from her fragile body. Absolutely nothing magically changed for 18 agonizing months of intense, violent petitionary prayer. Her terrifying condition remained exactly the same. Then Catherine miraculously encountered Joel's breathtaking teachings entirely on majestic recognition prayer. At first, her terrified ego violently thought it was just another cheap human technique. But the earth-shattering shift miraculously happened exactly one quiet morning when Catherine completely stopped, desperately asking God to magically heal her fragile body, and simply, fiercely recognized the flawless wholeness, already perfectly present, exactly in absolute consciousness. She was absolutely not violently trying to magically create health or desperately destroy terrifying illness. She was simply, majestically becoming profoundly aware of the absolute spiritual reality that had always flawlessly existed, completely independent of terrifying medical diagnoses or violent physical symptoms. Within exactly 3 quiet weeks, her terrifying symptoms miraculously began beautifully diminishing. Within exactly 2 quiet months, her stunned earthly doctors were breathtakingly amazed exactly at medical test results showing miraculous, significant improvement. Let us fiercely dive into the breathtaking first complementary practice. Joel Goldsmith profoundly taught to flawlessly deepen your majestic recognition prayer. He absolutely called this listening prayer. The vast majority of humanity, tragically, violently talks completely non-stop during their exhausting prayer. They frantically make cheap requests, desperately declare fragile affirmations, and exhaustingly try to magically instruct a distant God. But Joel flawlessly taught that true, absolute transformation miraculously happens only, exactly, in the profound, breathtaking silence exactly. After you permanently stop violently talking, after you beautifully recognize God's absolute presence, you must majestically wait entirely in receptive silence. You are absolutely not desperately waiting for cheap human words or toxic earthly instructions. You are fiercely, actively listening exactly with your absolute, whole spiritual being. This majestic listening is absolutely not passive. It is profound, active receptivity, exactly where flawless divine wisdom can miraculously impress itself entirely upon your majestic consciousness, completely, without violent interference from your toxic human agenda. You must beautifully practice this exactly by sitting profoundly quietly for 5 majestic minutes, exactly after your recognition prayer. Do absolutely not violently force anything. Do absolutely not exhaustingly analyze or desperately expect. Just beautifully remain flawlessly present and majestically receptive. Witness the breathtaking experience of Timothy. He beautifully practiced this majestic listening prayer daily and miraculously discovered that absolute, flawless earthly solutions to terrifying problems often flawlessly arose spontaneously exactly during or after these quiet listening sessions. Absolutely not as cheap magical voices from heaven, but exactly as natural. Breathtaking clarity miraculously emerging entirely from his flawlessly aligned majestic consciousness. The majestic second complementary practice is exactly what Joel profoundly called living by grace. This breathtaking practice majestically means beautifully going entirely through your terrifying earthly day, fiercely recognizing that absolute spiritual power, absolutely not exhausting, toxic human effort flawlessly accomplishes exactly what needs doing. You responsibly still beautifully work, flawlessly plan, and practically act, but entirely from a majestic consciousness that flawless divine intelligence beautifully guides and flawlessly supports absolutely each earthly activity. You permanently stop violently trying to exhaustingly make cheap earthly things magically happen entirely through toxic human willpower alone. Living by grace majestically means beautifully pausing exactly throughout your terrifying day to flawlessly reconnect entirely with absolute recognition. Beautifully recognize God's flawless harmony exactly before terrifying conversations. Fiercely recognize divine abundance exactly as absolute fact before devastating financial decisions. These majestic, brief recognition moments flawlessly keep you entirely aligned exactly with absolute truth, rather than being violently swept entirely into terrifying fear reactions. Let us fiercely examine the absolute transformation of Christine. She was a fragile earthly nurse who previously violently exhausted herself, desperately trying to magically heal fragile patients entirely through toxic personal human effort. When she miraculously learned to fiercely recognize flawless divine life, already perfectly present, exactly in each fragile patient. Her terrifying earthly work miraculously transformed. She responsibly, still, flawlessly provided excellent earthly medical care, but entirely from a breathtaking consciousness of majestic cooperation, exactly with absolute spiritual power, completely, rather than terrifying human responsibility alone. Her fragile patients miraculously responded infinitely better, and she flawlessly experienced absolute, unshakable peace, entirely despite her terrifyingly demanding earthly work. Joel's breathtaking third complementary practice completely involves exactly what he profoundly called impersonalization. When violently confronted exactly with terrifyingly difficult earthly people or devastating situations, you must fiercely recognize that the terrifying problem is absolutely not the fragile human person. It is entirely toxic material sense perception, merely appearing exactly as that fragile person. You are absolutely dealing entirely with fragile appearance, absolutely not with eternal spiritual reality. This majestic practice flawlessly prevents you from violently fighting fragile people or terrifying circumstances, and beautifully helps you address the absolute consciousness level exactly where real, breathtaking change flawlessly occurs. If someone violently treats you terrifyingly badly, exactly, instead of violently judging them or desperately defending your fragile self reactively, you beautifully pause to fiercely recognize that in absolute spiritual reality, absolutely everyone is God's flawless, perfect expression. The terrifying negative behavior is absolutely only toxic material sense, absolutely not spiritual truth. This breathtaking recognition absolutely does not foolishly excuse toxic human behavior or cheaply make you a fragile doormat. It completely frees you entirely from violent emotional reactivity and miraculously opens the absolute space exactly for true, flawless resolution. Witness the majestic application of Nathan. He violently struggled with a terrifyingly difficult earthly teenage daughter. Instead of constant, exhausting battles over her terrifying behavior, he beautifully practiced, fiercely recognizing her flawless divine nature, entirely beneath the rebellious appearance. He still responsibly set healthy earthly boundaries, but entirely from majestic peace rather than toxic frustration. Over 6 quiet months, their earthly relationship transformed miraculously. His absolute consciousness shift flawlessly, allowed space exactly for her authentic, majestic self to beautifully emerge, completely naturally. Now, we must fiercely, brutally address exactly the terrifying, real challenges you will absolutely face. The absolute first major obstacle is that your entire toxic religious conditioning violently fights exactly against this majestic practice. Absolutely everything you have been tragically taught about prayer contradicts majestic recognition prayer. Your terrified human mind will constantly Violently default exactly back to exhausting petition mode, especially when terrifying problems violently intensify. Nancy miraculously discovered this devastating challenge immediately, every single time she quietly sat to practice. Her terrified mind automatically started listing cheap human needs, desperately asking for magical help, and tragically treating God as a separate, distant power. Even exactly when she consciously began with majestic recognition, within quiet minutes, she would terrifyingly notice herself suddenly, desperately asking for earthly things. This is completely normal. Joel himself violently struggled with this terrifying tendency exactly for agonizing years. The absolute solution is absolutely not to violently fight your toxic petitionary impulses, but to simply, beautifully redirect your absolute attention entirely back to majestic recognition, like flawlessly training any new habit. Majestic recognition beautifully becomes infinitely more natural, exactly with patient, consistent practice over quiet weeks. The devastating second major challenge is fiercely maintaining majestic recognition, exactly when terrifying earthly circumstances violently seem to prove its absolute ineffectiveness. You beautifully practice majestic recognition prayer, but the terrifying illness absolutely does not immediately vanish. You fiercely recognize majestic abundance, but the terrifying bank account stays completely empty. Every fragile appearance violently seems to mock your majestic practice, terrifyingly tempting you to exhaustingly abandon it. Charles agonizingly faced this exact terrifying challenge. He had beautifully practiced recognition prayer faithfully exactly for 3 quiet weeks. But his terrifying chronic pain violently intensified completely rather than miraculously diminished. His terrified mind violently screamed that this majestic approach wasn't working, that he desperately needed to return exactly to violently begging God for cheap relief. He terrifyingly felt foolish, continuing to fiercely recognize flawless wholeness, exactly while terrifying pain violently throbbed through his fragile body. But Joel profoundly taught that fragile earthly appearances, exactly during majestic transition, prove absolutely nothing exactly about absolute spiritual reality. Sometimes, terrifying false consciousness violently intensifies exactly before miraculously dissolving. The absolute key is fiercely maintaining majestic recognition entirely despite terrifying material appearances. The absolute third devastating challenge involves tragically, subtly using majestic recognition exactly as a toxic new form of desperate petition. You exhaustingly learn that majestic recognition is infinitely more powerful, so you tragically practice it exactly in order to magically get cheap earthly healing or to desperately produce money. You are tragically using majestic recognition exactly as a cheap human technique to violently manipulate absolute consciousness into giving your fragile ego exactly what it desperately wants. Helen beautifully practiced recognition prayer exactly for agonizing months with absolutely no results, exactly until she miraculously realized this terrifying, subtle trap. She had beautifully recognized divine abundance, but her fragile recognition was actually toxic petition, completely in disguise. She was recognizing abundance only to desperately get earthly money. The absolute, breathtaking moment, she miraculously shifted entirely to pure, majestic recognition, completely without any toxic human agenda. Her entire earthly experience transformed. The absolute test of true recognition is exactly this. Can you fiercely recognize absolute spiritual reality exactly, even if terrifying circumstances never magically change? Can you beautifully acknowledge flawless wholeness exactly, even if the fragile body never magically heals? If your fragile answer is no, you are tragically still violently petitioning. The absolute fourth terrifying challenge is the toxic human temptation to desperately explain majestic recognition exactly to others, or violently defend it exactly against fragile criticism. When you miraculously discover this earth-shattering understanding, your fragile ego naturally wants to violently share it. But Joel fiercely warned that exhaustingly explaining majestic consciousness principles exactly to fragile humans not ready to beautifully receive them violently dilutes your own majestic practice. George tragically made this devastating mistake exactly after grasping recognition prayer. He excitedly, desperately explained it exactly to his toxic prayer group. His fragile group violently reacted exactly with terrifying hostility, exhaustingly defending toxic traditional prayer and violently accusing him of false teaching. The terrifying arguments violently troubled George's fragile mind. Joel profoundly advised practicing majestic recognition entirely in absolute, sacred privacy, exactly until it becomes so completely established exactly in your majestic consciousness that toxic external opinions absolutely cannot violently disturb it. Beautifully live the absolute, majestic results entirely rather than exhaustingly explaining the cheap human theory. Let your transformed earthly experience flawlessly prove the absolute principle. Let us fiercely explore the absolute, breathtaking advanced application of majestic recognition prayer, exactly in specific, terrifying earthly life areas. Career and earthly creative work flawlessly provide absolute opportunities for recognition that the vast majority of humanity completely misses. Traditional, toxic prayer violently treats earthly work exactly as something completely separate from spiritual life. You exhaustingly pray about your fragile job, desperately asking a distant God to magically bless your human efforts. This toxic approach violently maintains the terrifying consciousness of separation. Witness the breathtaking advanced recognition of Frank. He had been violently struggling to exhaustingly build his fragile earthly practice as an independent consultant. Traditional petitionary prayer desperately asked God to magically send clients. Results remained terrifyingly disappointing. Then Frank miraculously understood Joel's absolute teaching that majestic consciousness itself is the absolute substance, beautifully appearing exactly as all supply. Frank permanently stopped, exhaustingly praying about his fragile business, and fiercely started recognizing majestic consciousness exactly as infinite creative intelligence, already beautifully being his work. This was absolutely not cheap, positive thinking. This was fiercely seeing completely through the terrifying false consciousness exactly to absolute spiritual reality. His entire earthly business miraculously transformed completely within quiet months. Absolutely not through magically changed external circumstances, but entirely through changed consciousness, flawlessly manifesting as naturally changed circumstances. Now, we must fiercely examine advanced majestic recognition exactly in terrifying physical healing. Joel profoundly taught that the fragile physical body itself is absolutely nothing but consciousness completely made visible. What terrifyingly appears as a fragile material body is actually the flawless spiritual body, tragically misperceived entirely through the toxic lens of false consciousness. Catherine beautifully practiced majestic recognition exactly when terrifyingly facing a devastating medical diagnosis that earthly specialists violently said required immediate surgery. Instead of desperately praying for a distant God to magically heal her fragile body, she fiercely recognized that exactly what terrifyingly appeared as her body was actually majestic consciousness taking visible form. She absolutely did not foolishly deny the terrifying symptoms. She beautifully recognized a profound reality where majestic consciousness can only flawlessly manifest as perfect form. This breathtaking recognition practice continued daily, exactly while terrifying symptoms remained. Catherine absolutely did not violently waver because she was absolutely not trying to magically make recognition produce cheap healing. She was simply majestically being aware of exactly what is spiritually true. Gradually, the terrifying symptoms miraculously changed, and the terrifying surgery became completely unnecessary, exactly as her earthly body flawlessly reflected the perfect consciousness she had been fiercely recognizing all along. Absolutely not as a future hope, but exactly as present spiritual reality. Advanced majestic recognition exactly in terrifying human relationships absolutely requires fiercely understanding that majestic consciousness absolutely not separate, fragile individuals, is the only absolute presence. Traditional prayer violently asks a distant God to magically change fragile other people. But Joel flawlessly taught that exactly what terrifyingly appears as other people exists entirely in your majestic consciousness. Joseph agonizingly faced deeply troubled, toxic family relationships, agonizing years of desperately asking God to magically change his fragile relatives produced absolutely no improvement. Then Joseph miraculously grasped that his absolute experience of his fragile family members existed entirely, exactly in his own majestic consciousness. He permanently stopped desperately praying for God to magically change them and fiercely started recognizing the absolute spiritual reality of majestic consciousness exactly as the only absolute presence. He beautifully recognized flawless divine love exactly as the absolute substance of all relationship. His family members' terrifying behavior did absolutely not magically change instantly, but Joseph's absolute experience of them transformed miraculously. Eventually, relationships that terrifyingly seemed hopelessly broken beautifully began healing, exactly as his consistent, majestic recognition of absolute spiritual reality flawlessly dissolved the terrifying false consciousness. Finally, fiercely witness advanced majestic financial demonstration completely through Barbara. Earthly money is absolutely not a cheap thing you desperately get from a distant God. It is majestic consciousness completely made visible. Barbara terrifyingly faced desperate, crushing financial circumstances. Traditional, violent prayer produced absolutely no relief. Fear violently overwhelmed her fragile, rational thought. Then Barbara miraculously understood that absolute supply is exactly what majestic consciousness is. Infinite consciousness must flawlessly manifest exactly as infinite supply because absolutely nothing else exists. Barbara beautifully practiced majestic recognition daily, absolutely not trying to violently create cheap abundance or desperately attract earthly money, but simply fiercely being aware that majestic consciousness always contains infinite supply, exactly as its eternal nature. Miraculous earthly opportunities beautifully began appearing exactly from unexpected sources. Her terrifying financial situation miraculously transformed flawlessly, exactly as majestic recognition permanently dissolved the terrifying false consciousness of crushing lack, exactly that had violently prevented abundance from manifesting naturally. The absolute total transformation through majestic recognition miraculously culminates exactly in living constantly, entirely from absolute consciousness rather than fragile, earthly circumstances. This absolutely does not mean terrifying circumstances magically stop challenging your human form. It majestically means they completely, permanently stop defining you or violently controlling your absolute experience of unshakable peace, wholeness, and abundance. You fiercely recognize that majestic consciousness alone is absolute reality, and fragile circumstances are simply consciousness made visible. Raymond miraculously achieved this sustained, breathtaking transformation after agonizing years of practice. He permanently no longer needed to exhaustingly remind his fragile self to recognize spiritual reality. Majestic recognition flawlessly became his spontaneous, absolute response, exactly to absolutely every terrifying earthly challenge and devastating circumstance. Life still brought human difficulties, but those fragile difficulties absolutely could not shake his majestic awareness. Integration into daily earthly life majestically means recognition beautifully becomes your invisible, absolute foundation completely, rather than a cheap, separate, special practice. You permanently stop exhaustingly thinking about recognition and simply, flawlessly live entirely from recognized consciousness. Witness the breathtaking integration of new earthly parents, Dorothy and Paul. Sleepless nights and terrifying earthly responsibilities could have violently destroyed their fragile peace using toxic traditional coping methods, but they spontaneously, fiercely recognized absolute spiritual reality exactly in absolutely every terrifying moment. When violent exhaustion appeared, they fiercely recognized majestic consciousness exactly as infinite life. Never depleted, when crushing financial fear arose, they beautifully recognized divine life exactly as the only absolute presence protecting their family. This was absolutely not exhausting. Constant spiritual striving. Majestic recognition had beautifully become their natural background awareness. The breathtaking ripple effect of your sustained, fierce recognition practice miraculously extends infinitely beyond your fragile individual earthly experience. As your absolute consciousness transforms, absolutely everyone, exactly in your majestic field of awareness, miraculously experiences that transformed consciousness. You beautifully become exactly what Joel profoundly called an absolute transparency, exactly for divine presence. Absolutely not through cheap human teaching or toxic religious preaching, but simply through flawlessly being majestic consciousness. Karen miraculously discovered this earth-shattering effect after 2 quiet years. Fragile earthly family members miraculously experienced unexpected healings. Stressed co-workers flawlessly solved devastating, long-standing problems. Strangers miraculously reported feeling unexpectedly peaceful exactly after briefly meeting her. She was absolutely not violently trying to magically fix or heal anyone. Her majestic recognition practice had completely transformed her absolute consciousness so thoroughly that fragile others miraculously experienced absolute consciousness infinitely more clearly. This is the absolute, ultimate secret Joel Goldsmith spent his entire earthly lifetime fiercely sharing. The majestic main point is absolute, radical simplicity. The divine is absolutely not a distant power you exhaustingly petition, but the flawless consciousness you fiercely recognize as already perfectly present, already absolute, already completely being your majestic awareness right now. Absolutely every terrifying moment beautifully offers a fresh, majestic opportunity exactly for recognition. Absolutely. Every earthly challenge fiercely invites you to choose between violently petitioning an external power and majestically recognizing the internal presence. This absolute choice made consistently determines your entire earthly experience. If this breathtaking understanding of Joel Goldsmith's true teaching has permanently revolutionized your spiritual consciousness, like this video right now. Subscribe for more absolute, transformational, mystical Christianity, wisdom, and powerfully leave the exact words I recognize, divine presence in the comments below to permanently confirm your absolute shift exactly from exhausted seeking to majestic finding today.